Petro himself used the world stage at the United Nations to argue that oil is more dangerous than cocaine. Maybe that's why he is hitting the Colombian oil industry harder than he is hitting the drug cartels. But unfortunately, the United States is applauding his behavior, because when Secretary of State Blinken met with President Petro, he said he strongly supports the approach Petro is taking to counter narcotics. My understanding was that the United States is in the business of fighting drug trafficking, not abiding it. Once again, at this hour, Colombia is sinking into the dark days of the 80s, when it was infamous for drugs and violence, to the chagrin of respectable Colombians, many of them living in my district, Florida 27. On the political front, President Petro displayed his poor judgment in Belgium when he said that he didn't see a difference between siding with the United States or siding with Russia, between the United States or Russia. Well, I don't think there is any doubt that Russia at this hour is a global pariah whose brutal war against Ukraine has killed hundreds of thousands of people and has caused levels of destruction not seen in Europe since the Nazis. Closer to home, Petro has embraced one of Russia's most important allies in the Western Hemisphere, Venezuela. When President Petro reopened their shared border, dictator Nicolás Maduro and thief-in-chief, Freddy Bernal, were there to greet him. You may know Maduro, but if you don't remember who Bernal is, he was a close confidant to Hugo Chavez and the leader of the repressive apparatus against the Venezuelans. On top of that, Bernal is on the United States blacklist. Now let's go to the environment. President Biden is aligned with Petro on a very dirty climate agenda. And the question is, where are the environmentalists? United States and Colombia produce some of the world's cleanest energy, but both countries have halted their domestic production. We in the United States were buying oil from Venezuela, whose refineries break all environmental regulations, resulting in the dirtiest oil produced on Earth. And I haven't heard one single Biden official or supporter protesting this pro-pollution policy. On the crime front, President Petro is negotiating with the two largest drug traffickers in Colombia. First, Clan del Golfo. Presence in 28 countries, has 4,000 members. They traffic 200 tons of cocaine a year, and they're the #1 trafficker of men, women, and children through the jungles of Central America to the American border. Number two, he's negotiating with a group called ELN, the Marxist Guerrilla National Liberation Army. 5 days ago, the ELN sprayed muerte a Maria Corina, death to Maria Corina, all over her offices in Venezuela. If you don't know who Maria Corina is, Maria Corina Machado is the top presidential candidate against Maduro and the best hope for democracy in Venezuela. So when looking at Colombia, a major course of correction is needed. Over the last 30 years, Colombia has made incredible progress. The scourge of Pablo Escobar was removed. Plan Colombia, with our help, triumphed. Álvaro Uribe defeated the guerrillas and brought security back to the Colombians. A new era of prosperity, democracy, security swept over this critical country. But now it looks like that will be all erased, and there's one man to blame, Presidente Gustavo Francisco Petro Urrego. For the sake of my Colombian brothers and sisters, this must not happen, and we, the United States, and the United States Congress should help the good people of Colombia. So I just want to say a few words for those who may be watching in Colombia. Al mirar a Colombia, necesita un cambio de rumbo. En los últimos 30 años, Colombia logró un progreso increíble. Se eliminó el azote de Pablo Escobar, triunfó el Plan Colombia, Álvaro Uribe derrotó a las guerrillas y trajo seguridad para el colombiano común y corriente. Una nueva era de prosperidad, democracia y seguridad se apoderó de este país. Y ahora parece que todo se está borrando y el único responsable se llama el presidente Gustavo Francisco Petro Urrego. Por el bien de mis hermanos y hermanas colombianas, esto no debe suceder y debemos estar aquí, los Estados Unidos y específicamente este Comité de Relaciones Exteriores, ayudando a las buenas personas de Colombia que lo único que quieren es paz, democracia y tranquilidad. I yield back. The chair now recognizes the ranking member, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Castro, for his opening statements.
Thank you, Chairwoman, and good afternoon to everybody. Thank you to our witnesses for your testimony and for being here today. I want to specifically thank Mr. Wells and Mr. Natiello for joining us. It's good to see you both again. I appreciate the opportunity to hear from our distinguished witnesses and to discuss the challenges and opportunities facing our two countries. I deeply value the relationship between the United States and Colombia and between the people of our two nations. For years, our deep ties with Colombia have enjoyed strong bipartisan support in the United States Congress, and I hope that we can continue that tradition in pursuit of a relationship that is based on mutual respect for democracy, human rights, economic prosperity, and regional security. Colombia is in the midst of change, so that much is undeniable. A year ago, Colombia inaugurated President Gustavo Petro and Vice President Francia Marquez, Colombia's first Afro-Colombian executive, who were both elected on a platform of change and departure from the status quo. As allies and friends of the Colombian people, the United States needs to be responsive to what the Colombian people have clearly called for through the exercise of their democratic rights. It's not the role of the United States to handpick any nation's leaders, and the Colombian people have spoken. To those who are concerned about change, I would say this: the ties between the United States and Colombia run deep, and I have faith in the democratic institutions of Colombia. Our relationship remains beneficial for both countries, and our financial and security support is essential to address key regional issues. I'm going to lay out a few of the priorities as I see it for U.S.-Colombia ties, and I hope to hear from the witnesses on these issues. The first is on the issue of peace and security. The Colombian people had great courage in negotiating the 2016 peace accords with the FARC. The agreement was a significant step forward for peace after decades of conflict, but much of the agreement remains unimplemented, particularly the ethnic chapter. I'm glad that President Petro has committed to fully implementing this agreement, and the United States, as Colombia's ally, should support these efforts. Yet, it's also important to recognize that Colombia still faces conflict, including from the ELN and other armed groups that impedes economic inclusion and security. The Colombian government has elevated efforts to negotiate a peace agreement with the ELN. I urge the Biden administration to be open-minded and provide technical support if requested. The second policy priority for the U.S.-Colombia relationship is cooperation to address shared challenges with forced migration. I want to start off by commending Colombia's decision to provide temporary protected status to almost 2 million Venezuelans fleeing the economic collapse and political crisis in neighboring Venezuela. We need to remind ourselves that it's countries like Colombia and Peru, Panama, Costa Rica, Mexico, and so many others that face the immediate and most direct impacts of forced migration. After the Los Angeles Declaration on Migration and Protection recognized that migration is a hemispheric challenge, as partners, we need to support Colombia in its efforts to fully integrate those who have fled Venezuela. And I'm glad that President Biden's budget request for fiscal year 2024 includes $33.7 million to assist Colombia with these efforts. Colombia is a country of 50 million people that has taken in nearly 3 million Venezuelans with open hearts. To underscore the scale of this, that would be like the United States taking in almost 20 million people, a number far beyond the 500,000 we have currently living in our country. As we recognize Colombia's actions, I reiterate my call for the Biden administration to pair their welcome efforts to support countries like Venezuela with open hearts of our own. I was incredibly disappointed by the Biden administration's failure to redesignate temporary protected status for Honduras, El Salvador, and Nicaragua, efforts that would have brought relief to those who have been in the United States for decades. I continue to believe in the need for redesignations for these countries and for Guatemala, and call on the administration to revisit their decision. The last thing I want to mention is the opportunities for the United States and Colombia to work together to combat climate change and promote inclusive economic prosperity. That includes collaborating on renewable energy, especially within the framework of the Inflation Reduction Act, and expanding regional integration through the America's Partnership for Economic Prosperity. I had the opportunity to meet President Petro and his cabinet in May, and I know that these issues are a priority for him and that they value Colombia's relationship with the United States. With that, Chairwoman, I yield back.
Thank you. Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record, and we are pleased to have a distinguished panel of witnesses from the State Department and the United States Agency for International Development who lead on the United States effort towards Colombia. Starting with Mr. Mark Wells, is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs at the Department of State. Welcome, sir. And we have Mr. Peter Natiello, is the Senior Deputy Assistant Administrator for the Bureau for Latin America and the Caribbean at the United States Agency for International Development. Thank you for being here. Your full statements will be made part of the record, and I will ask each of you to keep your spoken remarks to 5 minutes in order to allow time for member questions. I now recognize Mr. Wells for his opening statement.
Chairwoman Salazar, Ranking Member Castro, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss our current approach to Colombia, a historic ally in the region. As one of the oldest democracies and market-driven economies in Latin America, Colombia works closely with us to advance shared priorities in trade, security, migration, democracy, and climate, as well as the full implementation of Colombia's 2016 peace accord. During their April 20 meeting at the White House, President Biden and President Petro reaffirmed the strategic importance of the U.S.-Colombia partnership based on principles of friendship, mutual respect, cultural ties, and a shared commitment to democracy and human rights. The United States has proudly supported security, good governance, and rule of law for many years, which has contributed to Colombia's longstanding commitment to democracy. Our investments have paid dividends over the course of our partnership, enabling close cooperation under successive Colombian governments with differing political perspectives. The U.S. and Colombian people enjoy the benefits of a successful economic relationship built on the solid foundation of the U.S.-Colombia Trade Promotion Agreement. Since the agreement took effect, U.S. trade with Colombia is near an all-time high. We engage closely with the Colombian government in the context of the agreement to improve labor and environmental standards. The United States has been the strongest and most consistent contributor to the implementation of the 2016 peace accord, providing more than $1.5 billion in assistance since 2017. We work closely with civil society, the private sector, and the Colombian government to prioritize the advancement of and equity of women, girls, Afro-Colombians, and indigenous people, all of whom have been disproportionately victimized by the conflict. The United States and Colombia coordinate closely to address irregular migration, to promote safe and humane migration management, and to support long-term migrant socioeconomic integration in Colombia. In April, President Biden and President Petro underscored our joint commitment to counter human smuggling in the Darien region on Colombia's border with Panama. Colombia hosts some 2.5 million Venezuelans, the largest number of displaced Venezuelans in the region. In 2022, the United States programmed $104 million to Venezuelan migrants in Colombia. President Biden and President Petro committed to a comprehensive counter-narcotics approach that includes interdiction, anti-money laundering, and rural economic development. We commend Colombia's efforts to expand land titling, which allows individuals in rural communities to own their own land and pursue economic alternatives to illegal drug cultivation. At the same time, we remain concerned about record levels of coca and cocaine production, as well as alarming trends in homicide and violence that serve to undermine democracy. We are expanding and intensifying bilateral cooperation in intelligence and interdiction to dismantle transnational criminal networks and to counter illicit activities that displace rural communities. Investing in Colombian institutions that fight corruption and improve security and justice, like the Attorney General's Office, the court system, the Peace Accord transitional justice mechanisms, and the National Police Force, is a strategic priority that will protect both our people's health, safety, the environment, the economy, and rule of law. As the second most biodiverse country in the world, Colombia plays a vital role in addressing the climate crisis. The United States supports programs that advance environmental protection by countering the drivers of deforestation, supporting conservation of the Amazon, and promoting climate-smart agricultural practices. In addition to our bilateral work, the United States and other democratic nations have a responsibility to stand up for democratic principles and protect the rules-based international order. Colombia and the United States share a vision for a peaceful return to democracy in Venezuela and work closely to strengthen inter-American institutions. In conclusion, the Biden-Harris administration is committed to ensuring that the U.S.-Colombia relationship remains strong and productive for the benefit of U.S. citizens, the Colombian people, hemispheric stability, and the wider world. We have overcome many historic challenges together, and we are confident that our partnership will continue to thrive for many generations to come. Once again, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Wells, and I recognize Mr. Natiello for his opening statement.
Chairwoman Salazar, Ranking Member Castro, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on USAID's longstanding partnership with Colombia. USAID's work in Colombia spans several decades, 5 U.S. administrations and 5 Colombian presidencies. We partner with a broad range of Colombian stakeholders, democratically elected governments, certainly, Colombia's independent control organizations, its vibrant private sector, its active civil society, and marginalized communities. USAID supports Colombia's own efforts to invest in its historically marginalized and violence-prone territories in the following ways. First, to strengthen state presence in those territories. Second, to advance sustainable, licit economic development in those regions. And third, to create a culture of citizen rights and responsibilities associated with democratic governance. We support implementation of the 2016 Peace Accord because it creates the conditions to achieve those objectives. USAID has been a long-standing partner in bringing greater state presence to Colombia's conflict-prone regions, home to illicit economic activities, including narco-trafficking, land grabbing, illegal mining, and illegal logging. With the U.S. interagency, we've supported successive Colombian governments to increase public investment in these regions, helping to improve schools, roads, healthcare, justice services, and protection of social leaders. The Peace Accord strengthens the conditions for developing the agricultural bounty of the Colombian countryside while conserving Colombia's rich biodiversity and expansive tropical forests. USAID's long-term commitment to these regions has enabled thousands of farmers to abandon coca production in favor of licit agricultural products like the country's renowned specialty coffees, which Colombians are so rightfully proud of, and cacao, an important and growing sector, thanks in part to USAID's long-term commitment to that sector. The private sector has been a key partner in these efforts. USAID has accomplished pioneering climate change mitigation and adaptation work with Colombia. Our work has helped generate $27 million to date in carbon credit sales for Afro-Colombian and indigenous communities along the impoverished and isolated Pacific coasts. USAID has been at Colombia's side for many years to ensure that conflict victims can be afforded the truth, justice, restitution, and commitments of non-repetition enshrined in the 2016 Peace Accord. With the Truth Commission, USAID has worked to compile and publicize testimonies that have helped tens of thousands of victims understand what happened to them and to their loved ones. With that truth, they can begin the long and arduous healing process. Additionally, we've helped the victims' organizations to bring cases before the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, the Transitional Justice Court, charged with holding all parties to the conflict accountable. Advancing the full social and economic inclusion of Afro-Colombian and indigenous peoples is key to a stable and lasting peace and a steady focus of the United States' work in Colombia. USAID advocated for the participation of these groups and other historically marginalized Colombians in the peace process and advocated for inclusion of the chapter on ethnic perspectives in the Peace Accord. I note Representative Meek's presence here today and thank him for spearheading so many efforts on that front. We recognize that despite the signing of the Accord and the important advances in human rights over the past decade, attacks against Colombia's human rights and environmental defenders have risen in the years since the Accord signing in 2016. For this reason, USAID continues working with Colombian partners to protect human rights leaders and environmental defenders, prevent violent attacks against them, and reduce impunity for these crimes. More must be done to address this violence, and we're committed to ensuring it remains a top priority of our foreign assistance. In addition to the challenges of building peace in the country's marginalized regions, Colombia and the broader region are confronted with unprecedented migration challenges. Colombia is creating a model for effective migrant integration that holds lessons for this hemisphere and beyond. USAID has partnered with the government of Colombia as it implements generous temporary protective status and regularization policies, which help Venezuelans fleeing the disastrous Maduro regime and helping integrate Venezuelans into Colombian society deters them from having to make the dangerous journey through the Darien Gap. With the generous support from Congress, USAID continues to assist Colombia in its efforts to register Venezuelan migrants and help them to integrate into Colombian communities. After more than 5 decades of war, Colombia has taken important steps toward lasting peace, security, stability, and prosperity. The Colombian people still have much work to do, and USAID is committed to accompanying them in pursuit of our common interests. And we're grateful for Congress's unwavering bipartisan support for the U.S.-Colombia relationship over the past 2 decades, which has made USAID's work to build an enduring partnership with the people of Colombia possible. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wells. I'm sorry, thank you, Mr. Natiello, and for your statement, and I recognize myself now for 5 minutes of questioning. I see that both of you did not mention some of the topics that we consider highly important vis-a-vis the relationship with Colombia, and I'm going to start with you, Mr. Wells. You know, Colombia supplies 97% of cocaine to the United States, and the question is, why did we stop monitoring the coca crops in Colombia?
Thank you for the question. As I understand it, the decision not to have a coca estimate this year, cocaine estimate, was a decision made a couple of years ago before the election of Gustavo Petro as president. We are the recipient agency of that.
It was made by whom?
I believe it was made in the year 2020, and it is by other agencies. I would have to refer you to the ONDCP.
Let me ask you something. Do you think that is that a good idea? I mean, maybe someone else negotiated it, but the Biden administration could say, that's not a really very good idea, and not really knowing how many new crops of coca are being planted in Colombia. What do you think about it? Don't you think it's outrageous?
There are
that we don't know?
There are various counts that are taken. So one is by that is overseen by the ONDCP. There is another, which is the Office of National Drug Control Policy. There's also one by the UN Office of Drug.
Yeah, but the UN doesn't. Don't you
crime.
think that the United Nations will will have the resources and the technology that we have in our intelligence agencies to really know? I mean, you personally, what do you think about that? You being the Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Western Hemisphere, you know, you're in charge of Colombia. What do you think about the fact that the United States will not know how many more coca crops the Colombians are going to be harvesting?
So,
what do you think about that?
So as I said, we have access to other types of measurement. We have the UN ODC count, which
The UN is not the United States.
It is not, but they have been parallel counts for many years, so we know the differences. The two teams discuss, we understand their methodologies, and there isn't a resolution yet as to what the next steps are on
You understand
the
that the
new
United
COCA
States
estimate.
has left the game. I mean, we left the game and we're leaving it up to somebody else.
Let me explain how also we're engaged, though, is at the tactical level and operational level in Colombia, we assist the Colombian military and the police in doing their own tactical level counts. So they're looking for coca all the time. They use a system called SEMA. And as someone who has been been in the field implementing these programs, that's a very good tool for us to use. It helps us find the coca that we're going
But
after.
you know that it sends a very bad message to the United States is just not looking anymore. Now, let me move to another question. You know that President Petro is trying to negotiate peace or something with El Clan del Golfo. Clan del Golfo, as I said, my opening statement, is in two ignominious activities, drug trafficking and human trafficking. So my question is, what is there to negotiate? From the United States point of view, what is there to negotiate with El Clan del Golfo? El Clan del Golfo. I mean,
So
simple. Give it to me simple. What is there to negotiate with this, one of the most important criminal organizations in the world?
So we share your skepticism toward any dialogue with the Clan del Golfo. I can tell you what the intent is to not only negotiate with the ELN, but also with other politically motivated armed groups, but as well the Colombian government, the Petro government has conceived of negotiating with criminal groups.
But what
We
has
are-
the State Department said to Petro, since the Biden administration is close, close to this, to the Petro administration? Have you expressed your concerns to the president?
I'm expressing them now that we are concerned about anything that results in impunity for narco-traffickers, and we would be very skeptical of any processes that that give impunity to anyone trafficking drugs, any organizations.
Good. You're sending a message to President Petro as we speak, so maybe he'll change his mind. Now, what about the statement, and neither one of you said anything on your opening statements about what I'm going to pronounce right now. You know that President Petro said in Belgium that he sees no difference between the United States and Russia. I mean, that's a pretty unfortunate statement at this hour when we have the war with Ukraine. Do you agree with me?
I agree that the war against Ukraine is unjust and brutal, and it's
Sure.
all
What do you think
Russia's
about
fault.
Petro saying that he doesn't know the difference between us and them? What do you think about that?
What I can say is that 3 times the government of Colombia has supported votes against Russia's invasion of Ukraine at the UN. We are not going to agree with every tweet that Gustavo Petro does, and in this case, we don't agree with that. But we've been pretty consistent, and the Colombians have been supportive in international fora with regard to
So he says one
denouncing-
thing, but he does another. Well, that's good. Words are not, sometimes are not like actions, but it's all right. So besides the difference between the United States and Russia, President Petro also said that oil is more dangerous than cocaine. Oil more dangerous than cocaine. So what do you think about that? What does the State Department think about that?
Well, with regard to coca, I mean, I think I said we are concerned about the rising levels of coca and cocaine production in Colombia. With regard to his positions on oil, I can talk about that. You know, he said when he was elected that he was going to stop all further exploration or any new contracts in oil production. That's been his practice so far. We haven't seen him actually cancel any existing ones. The United States companies are fairly well invested in that area. He has expressed a desire to move and transition toward renewable energy. That's something that we support, and I think there's a lot of opportunities for U.S. companies to profit in that space. But I agree, there is an uncertainty when it comes to the hydrocarbons industry about what's next.
So basically what you're telling me is that he may be saying something but doing something different because the State Department is sending the message that we don't agree.
I'm saying
some of
he's
his
doing exactly
statements.
what he said he would do, is not to have any new oil contracts, and we haven't seen that
Yeah, but
yet.
the fact that he's comparing oil to cocaine and saying that cocaine is better than oil, for me, I think it's outrageous as well. And I'm just going to ask one more question, so I don't want to abuse my time, but your colleague, Todd Robinson, said that Colombia is a net exporter of security. All right, but we just learned that he wants to negotiate with the ALN and with the Clan del Golfo. So how can we interpret a net exporter of security?
I believe what the reference was to, that the Colombians provide security assistance to some of their neighbors, north, especially up in Central America. They've done so for decades. We've partnered with them through Southcom and through Assistant Secretary Robinson's bureau, INL. And so they have provided some assistance. It's been useful in the past. I don't know about the reference to
But do you consider that
The
Colombia,
ELN.
since you study it every single day, that Colombia at this hour under Petro is a net exporter of security? Being an ally of Venezuela, that Venezuela has the largest refugee migration on earth.
What I can say about that is that they have a relationship with Venezuela. We don't tell countries with whom they can have relations. He decided to do that when he came into office. I can say he definitely shares the goal of having a democratic solution in Venezuela. He hosted a conference in April with some 20 countries, and there those countries affirmed the need for Venezuela to return to the path of democracy. And affirm that the process that the international
Sorry, I'm
community
interrupting. I
is
have to,
undertaking.
My time has expired. I now recognize Ranking Member Castro for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Chairwoman, I'd like to yield my time to the ranking member of the full committee, Gregory Meeks from New York.
Okay.
Thank you, Rep. Castro. I'm tempted to, talk about our former president who impeached twice, now indicted twice, maybe indicted again for resurrection in January 6th, and the guy that is friends with Kim Jong-un. I would hope our allies don't look at that or think that is what America is. We're still a strong government, our institutions, so I'm not going to talk about that. Let me start by just saying this. Democracy in Colombia is not in peril. The people of Colombia have embraced free and fair elections for decades, even during some of the most challenging years of internal conflict. And I've been involved in Colombia since I've been here. I've been involved with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 presidents, from Pastrana, Uribe, Santos, Duque, and now Petro. And that's our job, is to deal with who the people decide they want to be their president. That's democracy. Elections. Count the votes. Don't deny them after they're counted. Count the votes, and the people decides who their president is. What would imperil Colombia, and indeed the region, are the Republican proposed cuts, roughly 30% for our entire state foreign operations and related programs budget. These steep cuts would deeply impede our ability to provide humanitarian and development assistance at this pivotal time in Colombia. And I might add that last year we just celebrated our 200-year-long bilateral relationship, applauded free and fair elections, witnessed a peaceful transition of power, and supported the ushering in of a diverse, inclusive, and progressive administration under President Petro and Vice President Marquez. The narrative that Colombia has, quote, big problems with democracy, with its institutions, with the economy, and with President Petro's total peace policy is divisive and counterproductive, particularly when that narrative is used against his interests in negotiating with the ELN to extend peace beyond the 2016 peace accord. Colombia is a democratic country with a democratically elected government and democratic institutions and process in place. One change in policy that we may disagree with does not change our shared common values and histories. As we strive to reach common goals, we should do so in partnership. Additionally, I'm deeply concerned that withholding funding in Colombia runs contrary to the United States drug policy, security, and commercial interests. The shared challenges we have can only be addressed if we support Colombia's efforts toward lasting peace and strengthening institutions and access to justice. We must help Colombia build up civic participation and civilian services in the most rural areas, those areas where oftentimes indigenous and African Colombians live, and which Petro says he is focused on. I was there at his inauguration, and for the first time, I heard those communities talked about extensively. I heard it under President Uribe, and I heard it under President Santos also. The assistance that we provided for decades in a bipartisan fashion does just that. It competes with the drivers of illicit economies and violence to renew belief in democracy and ushers in much-needed change. What's confusing and shocking to me is watching my colleagues across the aisle complain about the influence of China and other adversaries while simultaneously proposing to no longer support our strongest allies in the region. We do not advance United States interests if we withdraw from the table, nor do we address these challenges if we shut out and deny regional stakeholders from being at the table. A peaceful future for Colombia may require dialogue with a Cuba or Venezuela, particularly when it concerns negotiation with the ELN or addressing the migration challenge head-on. Colombia is not sliding into a socialist state. I've worked closely, as I said, with every Colombian president, since I was elected to Congress because I believe in the potential of the Colombian people. I've fallen in love with the Colombian people and their strife and moving for democracy. I've seen them at each one of these elections stand in line and make sure that their voices are heard with their vote. I saw it in this last election that elected Petro. That's democracy, not someone coming from someplace else and saying that you should not be. I know that constructive dialogue and cooperation between our countries will reap benefits on both sides of our bilateral relationship. And again, I want to thank the witnesses that are here. I don't want to take up any more time from this distinguished panel, but let me just say that we've got to listen and work with our allies in the region. Not just be above them and tell them you do what we tell you to do, but let's promote those democracies and look at those things that we have in common. And as what took place when President Petro came here to visit President Biden and members of Congress, he's indicated that he's willing to continue to do just that. And I yield back.
Thank you, Chairman Meeks. And I just want to add that we are also in love with the Colombian people, and I represent hundreds of thousands of them. And reality is that we want to keep it that way for 200 years, like you said. We want to keep free and fair elections for the Colombians. Our concern is that Petro may stop that for the next 200 years. But thank you. Now I recognize Congressman Self for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We just heard the term decades. Here in our own country, we realize that the past decades really don't matter because of the open border policy under this current president. So my point is that current presidents make a difference. Witness our own open border policy. Words, not actions. So my question is, we've heard a lot about this 2016 agreement with the FARC. Does the FARC-EP and Segundo Marquetalia represent a threat to Colombia?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. Yes, both of those are foreign terrorist organizations under our law. Both the FARC-EP and the Segundo Marquetalia are derivatives of the old FARC that signed the 2016 peace agreement.
So what is your assessment of their future? Because the FARC was years and years in Colombia. What is your assessment of their future in Colombia?
So these are people who either did not agree with the original peace accord, or they never, or they signed it and then later defected from that. In the Segunda Marquetalia case, many of them have taken up residence in Venezuela. In the case of the FARC-EP, and I'm speaking very generally here, they function inside the Colombian borders. They are politically motivated, but I would say predominantly they are narco-trafficking organizations solely dedicated to trafficking.
Okay, do you believe your words on page 2, longstanding commitment to democracy? I think Mr. Meeks just addressed that. Counter smuggling in the Darien region, you talked about, we now see Darien peaking at like 400,000. You intensifying bilateral cooperation in intelligence and interdiction to dismantle transnational criminal networks and counter illicit activities. Do you believe those words? Then fight corruption and improve security and justice with the Colombian institutions. Is that going to happen, or is that cooperation possible under this president?
So earlier this summer, Congressman, and thank you for that question, we worked with the Colombians and the Panamanians to undertake law enforcement activities and border control enforcement in both of those, both sides of that border in the Darien region. They did that with some technical assistance from Southcom. The idea was to go after human smuggling rings in that area and try to at least counter over the summer the effect of those. When it comes to the institutions, I'll refer you to the Attorney General's office, which has a long-standing tradition of independence. It is, in fact, investigating some of the allegations made against President Petro. We have invested maybe hundreds of millions of dollars in that organization over the years. It's the organization that took down Pablo Escobar and does prosecutions against all manners of drug traffickers.
Why your focus on Venezuela in your testimony?
Well, Venezuela and Colombia are sister republics. They have a shared population. When the FARC was attacking the Colombian people so violently in the 90s, many Colombians fled into Venezuela. Now you're seeing a reverse of Venezuelans fleeing the misery and poverty brought on by the Maduro regime into Colombia.
Exactly. Thank you. So that's why I think we have got to focus on what is happening there, not the rosy perspectives that you gave us. And one more point about the Darien Gap, and my time will be up. It is so dangerous, and you probably know this, that your government, the United States government, it is so dangerous that we issue pre-rape kits to the females transiting the Darien Gap. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. Now we're going to recognize Congresswoman Kim Lager Dove for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank you witnesses for being here today. I want to first state that I do not support the premise of this hearing, which is that we should be attacking a partner because the elected government's priorities don't align with our domestic views. It is patronizing and paternalistic and anti-democratic to weaponize our relationship in order to wield veto power over the domestic political process of our democratic partners. And it brazenly resurrects a destructive Cold War approach that caused deep instability, endangered mistrust, and ruptured relations in ways we are still trying to repair. And as I just have been listening, talking about, well, you have a president who's saying something, do you agree with what they've said? I don't want to follow our ranking member, but we did have a former president who said a whole bunch of things, who said that he could shoot somebody in the face walking down Fifth Avenue and nothing would happen to him, who said he could grab a woman, by her genitalia, who said we should have a complete and total shutdown of Muslims entering the United States, who said that laziness is a trait in blacks, who said about Mexican Americans, they're rapists, even though some of them, I assume, are good people. I could go on and on. I would hope that no one on this committee supports those kinds of statements. It's about allowing people to have free and fair elections in their own country. I hear things on the floor that I don't agree with. It's not about attacking that individual person. I also want to say before I mess up my notes that the United States remains Colombia's main trading partner. Colombia is a top destination for United States agricultural exports, valued at more than $4.2 billion. Over 500 American companies have arrived in Colombia over the past decade, with investments worth $26 billion. We're talking about GE, Amazon, Cisco, IBM. Colombia and the United States share one of Latin America's most comprehensive defense cooperation frameworks. Since Pedro has been sworn in, over 8 multinational operations have been conducted between the Colombian Navy and the United States. Colombian National Police have conducted over 104 joint operations with U.S. law enforcement agencies. Operational results against drug trafficking, and don't get me started on our drug policy in the United States, because we only seem to want to go after certain people, and maybe if people stop using drugs, we'd have to stop having drug policies that disproportionately impact black and brown people. I digress. Operational results against drug trafficking since President Pedro took office show figures on interdiction seizures and the destruction of criminal infrastructure. 609,000 tons of cocaine seized. 887,000 tons of coca leaf seized. 61,000 tons of cocoa base seized. It sounds to me like we have a good partner. Last I checked, in any kind of relationship, an effective partnership isn't you agree 100% of the time on 100% of things. I don't know a partnership like that. I don't know a marriage like that. So I don't know why we're trying to be very discriminatory when it comes to Colombia. So none of those were questions. I apologize, but I'm irritated. But I will ask you both a question. Oh, help me, Jesus. Can you speak in just, maybe not, maybe in 30 seconds or less, very interested in the ways that your programs and your engaging of the Colombians and the Colombian government are addressing issues like illegal mining and discrimination against Afro-Colombians and human rights issues, because those are also important things, as well as reminding people how important it is to tell the truth. You only have 18 seconds.
Yeah, thank you so
I'm so sorry.
Thank you so much for the questions, Representative. I'll just say in the short time that I have that USAID is actively involved in working with the Colombian government, successive Colombian governments, and communities in mining areas to help formalize informal miners so that they can protect workers' rights, they can pay taxes, they can sell their gold to legal markets, et cetera. We've been doing that for many years. And we've had some important successes with it, pilots that Colombia can then use to scale to reach this issue on a broader scale with more people and more miners and more communities. And just in terms of our work with Afro-Colombians and indigenous, thanks to the generosity of this Congress and the really...
Your time is up.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks to you. Thank you, Congresswoman Kem-Lager-Dove. And then a vote has been called on the House floor, as you know. Therefore, the subcommittee will have to recess, and we will reconvene following the vote. There's only one vote, so the subcommittee stands in recess. So the subcommittee will reconvene, and I will now recognize Congressman Stanton for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Thank you very much, Chairwoman. Thank you both of our witnesses for being here today and your patience with votes in the middle of our hearing. I represent Arizona, which is no stranger to the challenges and opportunities of migration, the harms of drug trafficking, or the competition posed by China. These are complex issues that require multilateral solutions and strong bilateral ties. And Colombia has been a reliable partner on these fronts. Recently, working with our State Department to set up a regional processing center for migrants journeying through Latin America. These centers pre-screen individuals to see if they are eligible to enter the United States legally and are intended to slow the flow of migration after the end of Title 42. Colombia is one of only 3 Latin American countries working with the United States on this important project. Colombia also hosts more than 2.5 million Venezuelan migrants and refugees who have fled the autocratic Maduro regime. These migrants need help settling in Colombia, and the United States Agency for International Development provides funding for just that purpose. Last year, USAID granted around $30 million to support food security, health care, job training so that Venezuelan migrants could find a home in Colombia rather than making the dangerous trek north to the United States. Our country has also worked with Colombia on counter-narcotics efforts. The 2021 U.S.-Colombia counter-narcotics strategy set about holistically reducing coca supplies by targeting laboratories and traffickers, investing in the security and economic development of the rural areas, and restoring tropical rainforests that have been turned into cocoa fields. Finally, while I hope that Colombia establishes diplomatic ties with Taiwan, I also recognize that Colombia is one of only 12 Latin American or Caribbean countries that is not a member of China's Belt and Road Initiative. Instead, it maintains close ties with the United States, which is its largest trade and investment partner. With this strong relationship as a backdrop, I have a few questions for Deputy Assistant Secretary Wells. Recently, the State and Foreign Operations Appropriations Subcommittee voted to defer funding to Colombia, potentially leaving the State Department and USAID with no designated funding system to work on projects with Colombia. Does this undermine the progress we made to make America safer?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. Let me just say that the shared goals that we have in Colombia include countering transnational crime and drug trafficking, promoting peace and security, protecting the Amazon, preventing and responding to human rights violations, reducing irregular migration influx, and supporting the government of Colombia to integrate the Venezuelan communities. So the funds that we get, we use to do some of these things. It's to increase the operational capacity of the Colombian National Police and their military, which serve as staunch allies for us in the region in all kinds of operations. We support the Attorney General's office and Colombia's justice sector, which are critical components in maintaining Colombia's constitutional checks and balances. We also do peace accord implementation. We protect human rights and social and environmental defenders who face increased risk of attack. And we support, as I mentioned, the programs that allow us to help Venezuelans, instead of going north, they settle down in Colombia and integrate into Colombian societies. And we protect the Amazon, including supports to programs to support deforestation and promote agriculture that does not harm the environment. Those are all the things that we can do when we have a consistent flow of assistance.
If we were to defer this funding, as the subcommittee on in appropriations recently voted on, how would such a deferral encourage Colombia to create closer ties with China?
So their relationship with China, as you mentioned, we are still the #1 investor. We're the #1 trading partner with them. As you mentioned, they have not signed the Belt and Road Initiative. I know that President Petro has talked about that or has considered that. But the U.S. companies are still quite vibrant there, and we have a robust, we have a trade agreement. They do not have one with China. Were we to back out of this, this decades-long investment in security and social ties, we would be surrendering a vital strategic ally in the region and basically a partner that can work with us on an array of issues.
Final question, same thing, if we were to defer funding, how would it impact Colombia's ability to work with the U.S. on migration and counter-narcotics?
So in the same way, we depend on the Colombian military and police to effect all kinds of seizures, detection and monitoring. They're fully integrated with the U.S. military when it comes to detecting and monitoring cocaine shipments through the region. That would suffer if we did not have that funding.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you, Congressman. And now I'm going to recognize myself for 5 minutes. I just have a few more questions that I would like to share with you. And specifically, Mr. Wells, you said during your testimony that that President Petro works very well with the rest of Central American countries that are exporting people to the United States. But I just want to share with you the fact that the Panamanian foreign minister and some people at the highest level of the Panamanian government came to my office and told me specifically that they have a problem with Colombia because more than 400,000 people have arrived through the Darien jungle, and Colombia really doesn't stop them. On the contrary, Colombia and under the Petro administration lets them come through, and the Panamanians find themselves having a major problem because they cannot absorb so many people trying to go through Central America to get to the Mexican border. So could you please explain to me what is the difference between your statements and what the Panamanians are experiencing on the ground?
Thank you for the question. As I mentioned, there are 2.5 million Venezuelans who have stayed in Colombia, so the Colombians are playing host to that group. That's a group that is not going north. There are a lot going north, and the United States engages in multi-country and multi-agency effort to basically take 3 lines of action. One is enforcement, one is
No,
diplomacy.
but I don't think that's what I asked you. I asked you the relationship between Colombia and Panama. Specifically, the Panamanians do not think that the Colombians are helping them stop the traffic.
I think it is a regular problem. I mentioned earlier we
But are you aware
help
what the
them
Panamanians?
coordinating.
But are you aware what the Panamanians are saying? I'm sure the Panamanians have come to the State Department and explained their concerns.
Yeah,
They need Colombia's help in order to stop the flow of people through the Darien jungle.
And when I served in Bogota from 2019 to 2021, I got the same complaint that the Colombians don't do enough to stop the trafficking or the free movement of Venezuela,
But
mostly
don't you think that
Venezuelan
now
migrants.
things are gotten worse and that Colombia is helping less?
I think there is an uptick in trafficking as the situation in Venezuela worsens. There are greater outflows of migrants, and we do continue to work with both sides
So
of
you
the
have not
Darien.
helped, you have not heard from the Colombians that concern that I just explained to you? You have not heard that from the Panamanians?
I have heard that in the past, yes.
But no, now in the present.
And I hate to apologize, but I actually don't cover Panama. So, but I know that it is a complaint, and I know that we work with them. That's why I mentioned the joint operations in the Darien that we worked on earlier this summer.
Okay, now what about the ELN? You know, as I explained during my opening remarks, that the Petro government is negotiating with the ELN, which is one of the 2 guerrilla movements in Colombia. The ELN right now is in the terrorist list. By any chance, the State Department is thinking or considering the possibility of removing the ELN from the terrorist list due to the fact that the Petro administration is wanting to negotiate peace with them?
No, we are not considering removing the ELN from the foreign terrorist organization list.
Good.
The ELN process is something that we are watching, we're monitoring, and we are in constant communication with the Colombian government about it. I think, as I mentioned earlier, we want to maintain some healthy skepticism about it because the ELN is a terrorist organization. They have started peace processes in the past, and they have not fulfilled it. Next week, there is a ceasefire, that is a 6-month ceasefire that is supposed to go into effect, and we call on the ELN to protect civilians and any victims of their terrorist activities. They need to be accountable for
And what do you
holding
think
on
about
to
the fact
ceasefire.
that the ELN sprayed graffiti on Maria Corina Machado's office? The Biden administration has been working with the Maduro government, and my question is, don't you think that maybe we should be sending a message to President Petro and President Maduro that Maria Corina should be protected and should be guarded against any type of threats?
We obviously condemned that act, and we were
Did
pleased.
you know about it?
Yes, and we were pleased to see that President Petro also condemned it, and he called on the suspension of Maria Corina Machado's disqualification to be lifted because he
Good.
himself experienced a similar treatment years ago.
Of course, we all want a democracy in both countries. Now, finally, you also know some of the comments that President Petro has made against the Colombian press. He called them specifically racist, enemy of the people, and that they have incited genocide. What do you think about the Colombian press? You have many of those members among you here in this hearing. In my understanding, the Colombian press is pretty impartial, and they do a good job. Do you agree with what President Petro is saying, that they are racist, the enemy of the people, specifically the enemy of the people?
No, the press, independent press is not the enemy of the people anywhere. I believe that the Colombian journalism is excellent. They have a lot of investigative journalism. And in fact, they're the ones that have investigated a lot of the corruption allegations that President Petro is facing now. And so
Good.
they will continue to do that because—
So this is a very important message that you're saying, Mr. Wells, and I'm very happy that you're saying it, because the Colombians have very independent, rigorous news media, and we need to preserve them. Regardless of how they are covering the news, that's up to them, which is the same case in the United States. So I'm glad that the State Department is sending that message to the Petro administration: do not touch the press. Do you agree with me?
Yeah, in fact, the existence really shows the strength and vitality of Colombian democracy today.
Indeed, and that's why we need to preserve that vibrancy in the Colombian democracy.
Agreed.
You agree with me?
I agree.
And do you feel by any chance that Mr. Petro, President Petro, may be one of those hindrances or forces against the continuation of that democracy?
As I said earlier, we have relationships with the institutions. I don't want to comment on every single tweet he puts out. I think he issues more than a dozen tweets a day. He's one of the most prolific tweeters. I will say we support Colombian institutions. We believe that Colombian democracy remains strong today.
And do you have any fear that those Colombian institutions may be under threat?
I do not.
Good. Well, let's keep it that way. Thank you, sir. And now I recognize Ranking Member Mr. Castro.
Thank you. Mr. Wells, you made a comment, and there was some discussion about the migration situation of Venezuelans to Colombia. And can you describe how Venezuelans have been treated in Colombia who are arriving from Venezuela there? Or either one of you, I mean, whoever is best suited to answer that. For example, have they been provided work permits, food, shelter, so forth?
Yeah, I'll take that, Representative Castro. Thank you for that. So it's noteworthy that Colombia has provided temporary protective status to 2.5 million Venezuelans. Colombia has advanced rapidly to pre-register and register close to 2 million of those folks. Colombia, by being registered, those Venezuelans have access to health care in Colombia. They can enter the job market in Colombia. They would pay taxes, I believe, in Colombia. They can put their children in school. And so USAID has been an important partner to Colombia in helping them do that. Colombia has established dozens of integration centers around the country to help that process. USAID is supporting Colombia in 11 of the centers that receive the biggest flow through of Venezuelan migrants. And again, our support has just helped that registration process. It's helped them get connected to health care, to help their kids get in school. And we also work with microfinance banks to provide credits to Venezuelan migrants so they can start businesses. And we provided business training as well to thousands.
And let me, well, first I want to say thank you to USAID, to the State Department. Thank you for your work there. And is it safe to say, fair to say, that if Colombia was not so receiving of Venezuelans, that many of those Venezuelans might try to make it up north, including to the United States?
So I would say that Colombia's efforts to register and integrate Venezuelans is deterring them from going through the Darien Gap and from going north. And that's one of the reasons why USAID works closely with Colombia to just to help them to support their Venezuelan brothers and sisters.
And, you know, I know because we've been discussing political leaders and so forth and the actions of nations with respect to migration. I mean, you compare that to the barbaric actions of Texas Governor Greg Abbott, who put death traps at the U.S.-Mexico border in the Rio Grande, laid razor wire, including in areas of the river that rise such that that razor wire becomes invisible to people who make their way and get caught in it, and also installed barrel traps with netting so that people get caught in those barrel traps. So if those folks had not stayed in Colombia, it's likely that some of those Venezuelans would have encountered these death traps on the Rio Grande. It's gotten so bad that there was a 4-year-old girl who was passing out in the water and was instructed by Texas State Trooper leadership to be pushed back into the water towards Mexico. Very barbaric, inhumane policies that you might expect to see come out of a place like North Korea or somewhere like that. So I want to say thank you to Colombia, to both its conservative and liberal presidents who have maintained that policy of treating folks humanely in both conservative and more progressive governments. And thank you all for your work in supporting them. I also want to ask you just one more question. President Petro represents change in Colombian politics, but I believe there's still substantial continuity in U.S.-Colombian relations. Can you both speak, or either one of you speak, because I'm short on time, to whether you've seen a significant change in our relationship with Colombia, particularly cooperation on such areas of national and regional interest since President Petro was elected? Has something significantly changed in the U.S.-Colombia relationship, in your estimation?
Thank you for the question. No, in the regional context, we still have great cooperation with the Colombians. As I mentioned, they held a conference on Venezuela and convened 20 countries to talk about the international community's response for Venezuela and encouraging a democratic return to democracy. I also say, just from as was previously mentioned, just that there is a continuation of extraditions. There's a continuation of military and military exercises. There has been no interruption that we can see in joint police operations to confiscate drugs. So institutionally, all of those pieces we see as having no change, and we continue to have good cooperation, even though there is a change in political perspective in the presidency.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your testimony. I yield back, Chair.
Thank you, Ranking Member Mr. Castro, and I want to thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony. Mr. Natiello, I'm sorry that I didn't get to talk to you too much, but I'm sure it'll be next time. And to Mr. Wells for being here, and the rest of the members of this subcommittee for their questions. The members of the subcommittee may have some additional questions for the witnesses. We will ask you to respond to them in writing. So pursuant to committee rules, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitations. Without objection, the committee now stands adjourned.